Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we're continuing where we leave off in Joseph's story. We're on part 7 now, but we pick up where we left off in 6, where pretty much, Joseph's brethren are moved with envy and hatred against him, so much that they cast him into a pit, and they see these Ishmaelite traders. So Judah comes up with the idea to basically say, well, hey, why don't we just sell our brother for silver and get something out of it, instead of just pretty much killing him in the pit and all that stuff. They go that route to sell him to these Ishmaelite traders, and then they end up taking him into Egypt, and they go to their father. All of Joseph's brethren do, and when they go to their father, they take a goat of the flock, and they slay it, and they take its blood, and pretty much they put that blood on the coat of many collars that Jacob has given Joseph, and they tore it and just made it look like that was all that was left, and that some wild beast out in the field had gotten to Joseph and devoured him. And that's what they pretty much lead Jacob, their father, to believe. And and it's a very likely thing as well, because in the area where they're at, there is some pretty fierce apex level predators there. I mean, they've got bears, they've got lions, like actual lions, in certain areas mountain lions, and they have all these different threats with the wildlife, jackals when you get closer to Egypt and areas like that, and maybe even around there too, really. But, they just have all these threats that are in the area from wildlife. So they lead their father into believing this lie. And Joseph is taken by these Midianite, these Ishmaelite traders, and he is taken and sold into slavery in the land of Egypt. And we're going to see where they leave off here. And we're in Joseph's story, part 7, Genesis chapter 39. And we skip 38 because that's just pretty much part of Judah's story. So we're going to jump ahead to the next chapter and get into the rest of Joseph's story. And in Genesis chapter 39, verse 1, it says this: And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down hither. So again, Potiphar, he's the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, which is pretty much a big deal because, Pharaoh, basically, when we come to look at Egypt, they're the most advanced civilization of their time at this point. And, pretty much where they're the most advanced civilization of their time, Pharaoh was, the king, and he was, the ruler over the people of Egypt. And Potiphar was his captain of the guard. So Pharaoh being, the king and the pretty much the ruler over the whole land of Egypt, Potiphar was his captain of the guard, and he was very high status, very wealthy and rich. He had a lot of, slaves, a lot of servants, and, he had a big property that he had, and he had these servants and these slaves working on the property all the time to do stuff. And that's where Joseph finds himself, once being the son of a very honorable shepherd that is just living life out in, where they're at in the land of Canaan, to pretty much being stowed away to the land of Egypt because of his brethren, and he's stuck there as a slave. And we're going to see how he handles his situation. So, Genesis chapter 39, verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So what we can gather from that, Joseph didn't just cower and give up and, go lay in a corner all day, every day. One, because he just couldn't, because nobody would let him. He couldn't do anything like that. But instead, he had his head held high. He put his faith and his hope and his trust in the Most High God, that, somehow, some way, there would be something for him at the end of this. And he's just going to deal with what his situation is in the right here and in the right now. And, he's stuck in this mess where he was sold as a slave. And it says right here, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So he was a prosperous man in the house of his Egyptian. That's basically saying he worked very hard. And not only did he work very hard, but he was also smart about his business, because God gave him that know-how to do everything that he needed to do, and he was very fruitful. I believe that name Joseph actually means fruitful, but I can't remember right off the top of my head right now. We'll have to kind of look into that later to just dig into the meaning of the name Joseph. But, pretty much he was just very fruitful. He was prosperous. He was very, very, what's the word? Pretty much he was very down to earth when it came to his work, that he just knew how to get the job done. He was prudent. He was very prudent about his business and his daily life. And, God gave him that prudence to just know how to do everything he needed to do, and it's also probably noteworthy too that him being Joseph, Jacob probably spent a lot of time teaching Joseph a lot of extra things that would help him out, more than the brothers, which would be out with the flocks and the herds and whatnot. But, he was probably being taught a lot of valuable skills, like, just the important things that you would need to know, like the math of things and reading and all this stuff. Because, see, in this time, that's a very valuable thing, right? To be able to do those things. And, pretty much not everybody could read, not everybody could write, not everybody could, do the add up type stuff, because, it just wasn't quite with the schooling and whatnot. But I've heard it said that, pretty much Joseph, he was very prudent when it came to that, and very educated. And it might be that Jacob taught him certain things too, that from what he learned. And, he just had more ability, like where it says he's prosperous. God made it so he was more knowledgeable and prosperous and whatnot. And that could be where he does so well. And in his case, being a slave, with all that kind of know-how and all that kind of extra ability, that it's only natural what happens next happens. So let's dive into that. Genesis chapter 39, verse 3, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So God's given him all this know-how, and Potiphar sees it, that the God of this Semite slave, this Hebrew, pretty much, at this time, I don't even think they go by Hebrew, but they went by Semite, like they were Semites, which means they were descendants of Shem. And, pretty much he's basically saying, well, wow, this Semite slave is very well educated. He's very good at what he does. His God prospers him. And, his God tends to him and has given him this ability to really prosper and just succeed at everything he does. So that's something that is worth mentioning. And when we get into Genesis chapter 39, verse 4, and Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. So he was overseer over all that was in his house, and pretty much he was as the number one slave, which really makes him more of a servant because he was the overseer of everything that they all did. Instead of him having to do all the backbreaking, really hard work, he's pretty much supervising everybody else, and he gets to that position because God was with him, being that descendant of Abraham and that descendant of Jacob who, has a great purpose, and, there's a lot of hope, and the future ahead of him is bright, and Joseph has that, and God was just compassionate towards him that he helped him to get here in this spot, to find favor with Potiphar, and just to put him here. And, it was a very good thing for Joseph that he had that, and he's stuck here in Egypt, but at least, it gets him out of the harsher conditions that he was in and put him in a better one, where he's more of the number one servant than that slave that was just put through all the miserable backbreaking stuff that would go into the building projects and all that stuff that, they were forced to do, and it's worth noting too, they would get whipped if they weren't going fast enough, if they weren't up to par with what the officers that were overseeing them were doing, or if any of them talked back, they would get whipped, and or beaten, like they had that to worry about too, whipped, beaten, they were talked down to and all kinds of stuff because they were considered inferior. They were slaves, they were just considered lesser. So God took Joseph out of that situation when Potiphar saw that God had blessed him, and he was put into a better position above what he was in, And when we look at situations like that, too, with the whole slavery thing, we look at how we got it, we can appreciate what we've got from that, stuff can be a little difficult sometimes, but at least we're not going through that. And that's something to take comfort in, is to know that it could be worse, as we see what Joseph went through, and then again what God got him past and what God got him through. Again, being overseer of all the projects that they would do, it's just a better position with more breathing room, and he still had to work hard, but it was more like a job at that point than the just awful slave labor that he underwent. In Genesis chapter 39, verse 5, and it came to pass from that time that he had made him overseer at his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. So, the whole house is getting blessed by God just for the sake of Joseph, his worshiper, and who is as a child of God and a descendant of Abraham, and they all look down upon them as, oh, they're just these Semite people, and this is just a Semite slave. But they don't know that the God that they serve and the God that they worship is the Most High God. And Potiphar, in this case, he's observing and he's seeing all of what Joseph's God is doing. And it's not none of the gods that they worship in their land, but it's the God that came with them from the land of Canaan and into the land of Egypt. And he wasn't forsaken by God just because he was in a different area, a different country. God was right there with him in Egypt as well. And that's what we see with God, that the word of God is very true when it says he will never forsake you nor leave you. And we have that promise with God that God's there for you and he's not going to let you go through it alone, just like he didn't let Joseph go through it alone. But we have that, and we're in 5, and then we're going to 6. So Genesis chapter 39, verse 6, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat, and Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So he just left everything to Joseph. He entrusted him with everything in his house, right? It means he thought a lot of Joseph, and he even favored him, that he just chose to do this and chose him to be his go-to guy and his right-hand man when it came to the business of his house. Another way to look at it is he was kind of like a steward at that point, because, he was tending to all the property needs and everything that went about with that, he was tending to. And steward's kind of an honorable position too. Now, it doesn't say that here in the text, but being this overseer, it's a higher status and it's a position of honor. So he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat, and Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. He was favored by Pharaoh, or not by Pharaoh yet, or at this point, not by Pharaoh, I'm saying, but by Potiphar, captain of the guard to Pharaoh, and probably favored by everybody that he came across because of his, his hard, diligent work ethic and his demeanor, his conduct, like everything that he carried about himself. He was probably just very favored amongst everybody that he came across, being in high favor with both God and, just the people he came across, like it says here in the text. And, it's not like he got paid or anything, because, Joseph was bought by Potiphar. But, he ate his food, and, he probably had stuff like better clothing than everybody else, for his status, and he probably had better living conditions. Like he might have had his own little living quarters. Because see, the slaves, like when he came in there, they're more than likely all kind of sleeping on the floor, huddled up together, and just in harsh conditions, sleeping on basically little mats or little, just not like a bed of his own or anything. They're treated very poorly. But because Joseph was the overseer over all that they had, he probably had better things than all the rest of them, though he didn't get paid or anything like that. He just had a better situation than what all the other people that came in with him and whoever was already there, slave wise, had. Like his conditions were just better because, he was the overseer over everything that they did and whatnot. But that's the message for today, and you all have a blessed day.